What's up? I'm John O, and today we've finally come to the end of our series Frequencies to Evoke a Feeling with our final video focusing on guitars. We already know lows and low mids convey feelings of bigness or heaviness, and we know that highs and high mids convey feelings of elevation, lift, and excitement. And remember, we always start by asking ourselves what feeling we'd like to evoke in our song. Once you've answered that question, be mindful of your tone basics that will give you the feeling you're looking for in each section of the song. Things like which pickup you'll be using, where your right hand is sitting when you pick or strum your strings, how hard or how soft you strum, and even how hard or how soft your pick is. And of course, we can't leave out your tone settings on your pedals and your amp. There are a ton of great videos on YouTube that cover each of these areas I just mentioned, so I'm not going to spend time on them, but just two quick reminders before we move on. Firstly, more often than not, the answer to your tone lies in the source, that is your hands, your fingers, and your guitar, not so much everything that's happening on your pedal board or your amp. Secondly, you should always be setting your tone in relation to the vocals and all the other instrumentation in the song. Next, we've already covered how playing lower down your fretboard works when you want your guitar to convey a feeling of bigness or heaviness, while playing higher up your fretboard often works when you want the guitar to feel light or upbeat. Now let's move on to more unusual things you can do with the frequencies in your guitar by looking at our 30-second pop hit. In the song, I started with my chorus guitars, then I pasted the same guitars in the verse. Yeah, I know, really lazy. But I didn't want the guitars in the verse to feel the same as the chorus guitars, so I used an EQ to create some movement in the frequencies of the guitar by doing two simple things. First, I rolled off some of the highs in the verse, and then in the chorus, I brought the highs back so that the increase of highs in the mix would add lift and excitement in the chorus. Nothing special, right? You've already seen me do this very same trick in the past few videos with all the other instrumentation in the song. And that's the point. It's simple stuff that's easy to do again and again, yet it's so effective. The second thing I did with my EQ is something new. I increased the Q on my high cut to create this little boost here. This is called the resonance peak because you get this buildup of resonance here that makes these frequencies jump out. If you're like, wait, what? What's a Q? Resonance what? Don't worry. A lot of you have asked me to cover EQ next, and I've heard you. So next week, we're going to be looking at EQ. Stay tuned for that. Back to this week's video. In contrast with the subtle EQ movement I created for the keys in part 4, I created this resonance peak to ensure that the movement in the guitar frequencies is noticeable to the listener. This is a really cool trick to use to create build-ups when you have guitars with relatively constant strumming. By now, you know I always give you guys a way to apply these studio tricks live, and you're in luck because guess what? You can in fact recreate this exact same effect live using a humble wah pedal. The cool thing is the exact thing I've done with this EQ, that is a high cut with a resonance peak, is exactly mimicking a wah pedal. Here, let me give you a more recognizable example. You could create the effect we used in our 30-second pop hit simply by starting your guitar part with your wah pedal all the way down and then very gradually opening up your pedal. It's exactly this kind of subtle stuff that does a brilliant job of adding interest in a live set without needing to be loud or flashy. This way, you're always serving the song. Okay, now let's get into the really interesting stuff. I'm going to be building on a lot of what I talked about in part 5, so do watch that first if you haven't. I want to talk to you guys about using chord voicings and inversions to create a sense of movement in the song. In the pre-chorus of our 30-second pop hit, I wanted to create this sense of winding down, taking it down before the impact of the chorus, like I sang in the lyrics. To achieve this feeling with the guitar, I chose chord voicings and inversions that allowed me to simulate that downward movement. The song is in the key of C, and the chords of the pre-chorus are A-7, E-7, and then a D-7 held for 2 bars. Or using the Nashville numbering system, I played a 6-7, a 3-7, and then a 2-7 held for 2 bars. There's a really obvious feeling of downward movement, which is exactly what I wanted. Now contrast that with a more typical chord voicing for just the A-7, while I leave my E-7 and D-7 unchanged. Just the fact that the A minor 7 starts lower breaks up this downward movement because the A minor 7 jumps up to the chord shape of the E minor 7. I also want you to notice that the highest note in the chord voicings play a big part in indicating the direction of movement. So in the case of the chord voicings I use, the highest notes would be. I do this a lot when I'm recording guitars for my own music or even producing other guitarists, going out of my way to look for chord voicings or shapes that allow the chords to travel up or down the fretboard depending on the feeling I want in that particular section of the song. Let me illustrate the power of this by using the exact same chords of the pre-chorus, only this time instead of a low dynamic pre-chorus, let's imagine we want a pre-chorus that builds towards the chorus. So in this case what we want is, you guessed it, an upward movement in the chords. So let's try and achieve that with the exact same chords, an A minor 7 to an E minor 7 to a D minor 7 held for 2 bars. Is this not the coolest trick ever? Notice for the last 2 chords, I'm supposed to be remaining on a D minor 7. But because I wanted to create that continuous upward movement, I went from one inversion of a D minor 7 to another that was even higher up the fretboard. Of course, like I mentioned in part 5, if I wanted to keep the guitars even lighter, I could safely omit the root from my chords because in most cases, it would already be present in the bass, so we wouldn't be losing any of the flavor of the chords. This sense of upward or downward movement works really well in parts of a song that act as a transition to another part of a song. Like a pre-chorus serves as a transition into a chorus, or the final part of a bridge often serves as a transition into the final chorus. In more static sections of a song like a verse or a chorus, I often look for chord voicings or shapes that are relatively close to each other to limit the movement up and down the fretboard from chord to chord to give the guitar a kind of smoother feeling. Okay, so I get what you did for these chords in this song, but how do I apply this in my song? So here's the sad news. You can either memorize every single chord shape for every single chord, or I could tell you the cold, hard truth for guitarists. You have to memorize the notes on your fretboard and get serious about your music theory. No! I don't want to hear it. You don't want to hear it, but I promise it will take your playing to a whole new level. One final note before we wrap up for today. In part 5 of this series, I mentioned that sometimes if I don't want an obvious major to minor distinction in my chords, I'll just drop the third for my chords. Wait, what? See, I told you gotta learn your music theory. Don't worry, it's not complicated. Quick refresher. The third is the note that gives any chord its major or minor distinction. And to illustrate the difference, I played a chord progression with just the roots and the fifths, no thirds. Just in case it didn't occur to you, this is exactly what we do when we play power chords. That is the root, the fifth, and an octave of the root. Of course, the power chord is the bread and butter of rock music, and this lack of major or minor thirds in power chords is precisely the reason why so many rock chord progressions or riffs don't have the feeling of traveling from obvious major to minor chords. That's all for today. If you got something out of this, do share this with your fellow guitarists or try the stuff we've covered in your own songs and post the results in the comments. I hope you guys have enjoyed this series and learned a thing or two. I'm John O and I'll see you guys next week where we'll be diving into EQ, so don't forget to subscribe for more.